Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Many of us tend to search, especially when it comes to midlife, to find out how we can have vibrant health and whether or not we can get in touch and answer the question, why are we here? The question is finding God and finding health, which will be the subject today as we explain God as an active, present, and accessible, that no one is or can be cut off or left off out of the divine presence. On the program today, we're going to be joined with someone who has been a Christian Science nurse for more than 10 years and is changing her focus from nursing care to the prayer practice of Christian Science by bringing more than 35 years of professional experience to her work as a practitioner of this healing method. And since 1995, our guest has lectured on the subject of prayer and healing throughout the U.S., Europe, Africa, and she travels from her home in Paris, France. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's going to be sharing with us the science and health with the key to the scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, and we'll also share examples from her public healing ministry and recovery from hardship. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Michelle Nanouche. Michelle, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.
Now, are we in Paris right now?
I am in Paris. Well, I live outside of Paris.
Oh,
yes, I'm calling you from a different time zone.
Well, there we go. Yeah, we're all the way down near Sedona, Arizona. So I guess we're both kind of feeling ourselves sort of in spiritual places here, aren't we?
We sure are. And if you're in Arizona, that was actually where I was raised in Phoenix.
Wow, things are pretty close when it comes in, since it's kind of a small world. Now, let's talk about this here, what we're talking about here today, the subject of the things that you like to lecture about.
Sure. Well, I'll be giving a lecture in the Portland, Oregon area as part of a broader tour that I'm doing in the U.S. this May. I'll be giving a lecture there entitled Finding God, Finding Health. And it's a subject that I love. As you mentioned, I came to this practice early in my life, spent 10 years practicing nursing as a Christian Scientist, that is, giving non-medical nursing care to those who rely on prayer for healing. Did that for 10 years, witnessed a lot of healing, got good experience in seeing the connection between not only mind and body, but one's understanding of God and how that affects health. And that's what took me into the full-time practice of Christian Science prayer for others, and I've been doing that for pretty close to 30 years now.
Now, speaking of which, when you say more than 30 years going in this direction, there must have been something, maybe a defining event that pivoted you or moved you into this direction. Tell us what that might have been.
Absolutely. Actually, for me, it was when I was 12 years old. Now, I should say that I was brought up in a Christian Science Sunday school, and my parents nurtured and supported my spiritual growth. I remember going to bed at night and how we would all pray together, as I was getting tucked into bed, growing up with that. Grew up with spiritual education in Sunday school that was based on the scriptures, particularly focusing on Christ Jesus' healing work, what he did, how he did it, what he was teaching others to do as far as prayer and healing. So I grew up with this information, but didn't have a lot of, I really was a healthy kid. I didn't have a lot of problems that required me to pray or do anything really to be healed until I was 12, and I impaled my foot on a nail when I was out mowing the lawn. Now, the hospital wasn't very far away. We only lived 3 blocks from one of the main major hospitals in Phoenix. So I knew that I could go to that hospital. But, when you're standing there in pain, 3 blocks felt really far to me.
It also feels like forever, too, doesn't it?
Oh, exactly. And so I reached out for what I had, kind of the resource that was available to me, and it was prayer. And I began to just pray and think about some of the simple truths of God's love for me, care for me, of my spirituality as the creation of divine spirit. Just simple thoughts, 12-year-old thoughts that came to me in that emergency situation, and the pain stopped. And that kind of really grabbed my attention. When my mom became aware of the situation, of course, she could have scooped me up and taken me to the hospital and would have at any point if she saw that the case wasn't going in the right direction. But I told her that I was praying and that the pain had stopped, and I really wanted, it was kind of the litmus test for me. Do I keep going to Sunday school, or do I get to say, forget all this because it doesn't work? I wanted to try to resolve this through prayer. And I had the support of my mom, and she bandaged me up. And later that night, when I, curious, 12-year-old again, wanted to know what was happening because I couldn't feel pain, I unwrapped my foot and saw that the wound had already closed. There didn't appear to be any infection involved, and by the next morning it had completely disappeared. That was a major turning point for me. I mean, as far as I was concerned, I had experienced the possibilities. I didn't really have a full explanation for what had happened to me, but I had experienced something out of the ordinary, and I kind of went from a sort of lackluster Sunday school student to the one who was sitting up straight and really paying attention to what was being taught.
Well, when you think about it, and you can't blame people who may take a look at Christian and then Christian Science, which to me are kind of a couple of different things when it comes to how people learn about them, especially in a religious structure or, the religious mainstream. And, for instance, when we think about prayer and healing, and you hear stories about people who are working with people specifically just doing prayer when maybe they should go and see a doctor and get on some sort of a medical protocol. And you're a nurse, so hopefully I'm pretty sure you understand what I'm talking about, where they just pray. I think you're bringing two things in together and working with them together, aren't you?
Well, actually, in Christian Science, the method of treatment involved is exclusively a prayer-based method. However, that doesn't mean that to rely on or practice Christian Science, one cannot make decisions about their own health care and choose whatever course of care is appropriate. As I mentioned to you with the case of the foot, had I not seen quick, good healing results, had my mother not seen that, she would have scooped me up and taken me that 3 blocks up to the emergency room, because ultimately healing is the point. But Christian scientists, when they come to a case, perhaps a case that one, under other circumstances, under other belief systems, would immediately consider an emergency or a severe problem that would take them to the hospital, Christian scientists, and I'm kind of generalizing here because each one makes their own decisions, but we come to this point of decision to rely on prayer because we have experience with it. Because, as I did when I was 12, we've tested it under circumstances. We've experienced the healing power that comes with it. There is methodology. It follows quite strictly the protocol, the requirements that Christ Jesus sets forth for what it takes to be a good healer, the mental qualities, the spiritual qualities, the pure life that backs that up. But at the same time, we have good experience and good results in healing through prayer alone. My nursing practice did involve giving physical care, but the people that I was caring for were not under a doctor's care and were not following any kind of medical protocol. No pharmaceutical medications were involved in their cases, and I witnessed all kinds of healings, from cancer to different forms of tumors, to asthma, to, I can remember a healing of a case of gangrene. Remarkable things.
So let's go ahead and touch on that just for a bit, Michelle, about, for instance, you were talking about cancer and tumors. Now, it's not unknown, and it's certainly not unusual to hear pretty regularly that sometimes, or in a fair amount of these cases, these things onset because of a person's lifestyle, specifically maybe even spiritually and mentally, the state they're in with how they live their lives. That their lives perhaps don't have the kind of level of meaning, or they feel that they're kind of on the outside looking in, perhaps even shunned, if you will. Whatever the explanation is, it all seems to be the same. They're separate, and this comes in, this devastating blow of perhaps, cancer or tumor, to sort of awaken them to the things they weren't paying attention to in the first place. Do you see the relationship there?
Yeah, definitely. It's that mind-body relationship. We really do need to, in our approach to care, encompass the whole person. Address the thoughts and the fears. Oftentimes it isn't so much even what we did or didn't do before, but the fear that we're holding on to that is the culprit, the fear that we have somehow neglected ourselves or damaged ourselves, or the fear and the guilt that comes along with whatever lifestyle may have preceded a problem. And here's where a spiritual approach to treatment is just so helpful, because this kind of swirl of or we can almost even say witch hunt of trying to figure out where the problem originates, what is back of it, in order to try to eradicate, almost spot treat various areas of our life, can be quickly resolved by lifting the entire case to the spiritual level, which works out from God's perspective of His creation as innocent, as perfect, as whole, as complete. And this is where my subject, finding God, finding health, takes the listener, takes the participant in this lecture to go to that perspective of what God is, that pure sense of God that is the overall authority over us. In spiritual healing, it's not so much that God goes to a problem in order to fix the problem, so much as that the prayer lifts the one who's praying to an understanding of God's view of them. And it's a watershed. It's more of a releasing of that sense, that negative sense, that false sense, that flawed sense that we're holding on to about ourselves. And as that falls away, what we find underneath is our God-given, enduring, permanent state of health, which is actually a spiritual attribute. There's a tendency to think of it in strictly physical terms, but health is actually a quality of spirit.
Well, I certainly won't disagree with you at all there. I've been doing this program now. We're going to be going on, 15 or 16 years by the end of this year. And certainly in broadcasting, one of the things that I found my natural path to be is this intrinsic curiosity to talk and to showcase people who I found to be fascinating people once you talk with them. And it's amazing how many of these people are right there next to people such as yourself, that you actually have a special gift that comes out to the people around you if they would just pay attention. We live in a world today, for instance, that's so full of celebrated celebrity, and it's funny how often I get asked, well, if you do radio interviews, do you interview celebrities? I said, well, I've had celebrities many times on the program, met them, interviewed with them, so forth. And I said, but quite frankly, celebrities aren't as interesting as people like yourself tend to think they are. I like to get them when they're 30 and 40 years down the road, when they've actually done a body of work, not necessarily just an entertainment, but what they've done out there in the world, when they finally realized, this was a vehicle that allowed me to do things that I've always wanted to do, sort of thing. And but what I've come to find out, especially because my focus has been in the arenas of personal improvement, things like that, is one consistency I hear about is the development of a very strong spirit which already exists, we tend to sort of smother that light out a lot through the opinions and attitudes of others and what others think about us. And when you take a look at, for instance, media, and this has been going on for decades, and not just limited to recently, especially with pop culture, they tend to do the very same thing, which is to allow us to believe that we are less than what we are, but here's the solution to make sure that you're full and alive and to that level. And if we could come to not buy into those messages and tap into the strength of our light and allow that to really shine and become vibrant, I would almost have to think, and certainly chime in your experience on this, that things such as sickness and disease come to a point where they just don't exist.
And that is ultimately what Christian Science is about. What its approach to healing teaches is that we have, as Jesus told us, we have the kingdom of heaven not as some far off distant place, not as some kind of magical destination after death place, but he said that kingdom of God, that kingdom of heaven, that kingdom of good is already within us. And one way to look at that kingdom is as a concrete, tangible sense of health, well-being, inspiration, joy, productivity. You know, there are just many different ways that we can describe it, but that is our present state as far as God's view of his creation. What we do is, you know, as you indicated, through outside influences, negative influences, pull us into holding on to a misconception of who and what we are. Now, we can keep spinning around that misconception, trying to doctor it, trying to improve it, trying to change it, or we can take the radical approach that Christ Jesus taught and that Mary Baker Eddy, as the discoverer of Christian Science, recognized in his work, that radical thought that allows us, that we have access to that kingdom and have a right to discover it here, not just hereafter, but we have a right to find it and to experience it here. And prayer plays a big role in that. When we understand and really follow the methodology that Jesus gives us for that healing prayer.
Now, there's a story. This may seem a little off the track here, but let's just kind of go with it because I thought this was a funny one, an interesting one because of the experience that you had, and I had something that almost was close to this, but it had to do with you rounding a blind curve on a mountain road.
Oh, you must have been reading my blog.
Yeah, I cheat a little bit too, but you know that's where you find out a lot of fun stuff. So.
Yeah. You want me to tell you the story?
Yeah, please do, because I think this is a fascinating one because we sometimes, when we get into circumstances, and if we even have a smidgen of time, I think this is that moment that we don't allow spirit to act. And we tend to intellectually react, and it's that much time given to the intellect that you end up finding yourself in a situation that you don't want to be in.
Exactly. Well, okay, so just picture the circumstances. I was in the UK, and I was a new driver at the time. So I was driving on the wrong side of the car, a not very experienced driver, on a one-lane road, but that was going two different directions. But it was one way, and there was a part of this road where it was a drop off on one side and a wall of rock on the other side of the road. And as I was approaching this blind curve, I saw just in front of me a flock of sheep on this road, this little skinny road, and a truck was barreling towards us. And there was no pull-off. There was nowhere for any of the players in this situation there was nowhere for us to go. And so I didn't have time, but what I did have was this tried and true place that I go to when I have an emergency. I had just enough time to actually literally close my eyes and scream, God. That was it. And while one might think that was, that I was swearing or, cursing or something. Actually, it was a transcendent moment of leaving that place of where conflict was inevitable and going directly to this bigger sense of the infinity that encompassed all of us, the love that protects truck, car, people, sheep, even the rock wall, that everyone was safe in this sense of God. I didn't have time really to go into the whole reasoning sense, but it was a refuge. I felt as though I was lifting us all up into this reality where there was no conflict, where nothing but harmony existed in God. I opened my eyes, 2 seconds later perhaps, and in my rearview mirror, there were these sheep behind me and the back lights of the car as it was heading on around the curve. I don't know if we leaped, jumped, disappeared briefly, but there was no conflict. Everyone was completely safe. And something that struck me about the experience was how calm those sheep were. We all know how skittish, animals are especially when you're barreling towards them and about to crush them. They start running in all directions. But these sheep were ambling across the street as though there had been no car, there had been no truck. It was a remarkable experience. I don't know that there is a physical explanation for what occurred. Metaphysically, I can say that we did. I did see us all embraced in this universe completely ordered by God, who is the divine mind that maintains harmony for his creation. There's no possibility for conflict in this mind. That's God.
You might also consider, as I had a guest on the program talking about waking dreams, would you have thought of that as a unique message?
Waking dreams, meaning a unique message in that perhaps it didn't happen but was more of a figurative experience?
No, that it was an actual experience, but it was a waking dream. I mean, when you think of a single road, when you think of the overwhelming idea of this truck ambling towards you and nowhere to go except against a sheer rock side or, a drop-off, and that sheep, because you consider that sheep and lambs are very consistently talked about in the Bible itself, that I'm thinking as a waking dream, and here's a flock.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by waking dream, a real divine message, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. I feel that all of our experiences are certainly teaching moments. I think that that experience was certainly a rock for me as I continued on in my own spiritual journey and in my practice for others. It makes, when you're faced with circumstances that seem impossible and you have survived the impossible, you realize that all things are possible to God. So yes, I would look at it as from a spiritual standpoint, it is a parable, it's a teaching tool, but it was also concrete experience. I didn't mention that I wasn't alone in the car, that somebody else experienced this with me. And I'd actually lost track of her for, 40 years, 30, 35 years or so. And it was only last year that I happened to, when I was out on a lecture tour, happened to run into her again. And we talked about that experience, which we had not been in touch for years, but we both remembered it exactly the same way. It had been just as much a significant turning point for her as it was for me.
And it says a guest on the program that I had a couple of years back would simply say, he says, the people need to understand about miracles or know about them is these are just things we haven't experienced yet. I thought,
That's it.
That's a pretty precise thing to say. Now, I myself have read quite a bit. There was a time some years back where I came into reading about Christian Science. It was fascinating because it was a book, I think it was called Simple Abundance, which basically is like a calendar book where you turn on a particular day and you read some insights of this author. I don't know if you're familiar with that book or not.
Yes.
But there was one point in July, and it was funny because we were actually having a little bit of financial struggle at the time, and she recommended this one particular book, and I honestly at this moment don't know what it was, but it was in the month of early August, I think, is where I just picked this up. It was a book of my wife's. She had it in and out of the closet. I knew about the book, but I picked it up. I started reading a little bit. was like, okay, I'm going to go get this book. And it was that book that led me into starting to read and discovering people such as Mary Baker Eddy, and that this stuff had been around, that they're calling, the thought and reality of today, that you're seeing a lot of what I would call metaphysical, I guess, teachers today talking about it actually been around for centuries. I thought,
exactly.
And I loved really reading these books of these different people, such as Mary Baker Eddy and the like. There was another one, and again, these names elude me because it's been a couple of years, but I liked that the political correctness was taken out and the direct message was there. And I think that as people come to see this, I was starting to find myself coming to a state of mind which was much different, to where I could have something good happen in my life or something bad can happen in my life, but either way, they were both okay. And that, to me, I found very fascinating, to come to that place when even the bad things in your life happen, whether it's an illness or whether it's a loss of a job, whatever the case may be, that was okay, too, because it was a special experience for me to grow and strengthen. And when you can come to that state, rather than feeling victimized, it's sort of like, as I was reading a little bit more in your blog, the mental state that is called a material state, we'll say, and that you say disease is usually or always induced by a false sense that is mentally entertained. And I thought to myself, that is so true, that it's how we think about, or, you might say that, it's the meaning that we put onto something that will actually cause that state to become true. And sometimes we just put too much meaning sometimes on the simplest things that can cause more problems than they should.
Well, and just by not recognizing the mental nature of all things, even to the extent that one may not be consciously attributing power to something that's bad for them, unconsciously, we're being affected by mental elements all of the time. And I think that that's a subject that Mary Baker Eddy took on straight on in her book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She does discuss the nature and reality of what God is, but she also goes into the intricacies of a limited mortal belief of a universe filled with good elements and evil elements, always in conflict with each other. And she takes that on, and as you were pointing out, the waking dream, she has a slightly different take on that waking dream as being more of a reference to experiencing a limited sense of oneself when one is actually an unlimited spiritual being. So a lot of what Science and Health is talking about is waking up from that state to gain access to reality. And in that passage from the waking dream to a truly awake state consciousness of reality, what you experience, what the human mind or what a limited view calls a miracle, is just divinely natural phenomena that is actually supposed to happen. You're not going to find much in the teachings of Christian Science that take a God's will approach to bad things that happen, to disease, to death. That isn't an approach that we take. We're always facing down, confronting the enemy, the belief that there is, which is the enemy, this belief that there is a power opposed to good, a power opposed to God, or something that actually can affect us in a permanent way, negative, permanent way. But at the same time, the teachings of Christian Science also face these beliefs. There's no kind of head in the sand approach to this.
Right.
It's a rigorous
I'll
it's a
just
rigorous
do it,
study,
when things are good, but I'm not so sure I'm going to do it, when things aren't so good.
Exactly. No.
So it would be fair to say that your lecture could be very helpful to someone who may not consider themselves Christian Scientist, or maybe even religious.
Yeah, in fact, my role as a lecturer is to go around and clear up misconceptions about what Christian Science is and how it works. So the main thrust of my coming to town is really transparency. Christian Scientists in general are open about their practice because it's effective, because they know that it's something that everyone would love and be interested in if they know what it actually is. But misconceptions come up around it, sometimes confusion between Christian Science and other faith practices. There's sometimes kind of a confusion that comes in there. My role is to come in and just bring clarity to the subject of what Christian Science is, what it teaches, how it works, to answer some basic questions. Anyone, what we're always looking for in the audience is the healer heart of the listener. Now, to have a healer heart doesn't necessarily mean that one is religious, but if somebody desires to be good and effective at what they're doing and wants some tools that are going to enhance their effectiveness, for example, a dentist who doesn't ever want to cause pain, an accountant who wants to get his numbers right every time that he goes to work on his books, that's the healer heart. And that's what this lecture speaks to. I assume that in every audience, everyone gets their own lecture. It's very rare when I always do an open question and answer period afterwards, and it's very rare that I hear feedback from somebody that indicates that everybody got the same message. Everyone kind of gets their own message, and I never know what they're coming for. But I'm always grateful to know that everybody can have a takeaway that can be meaningful to them, even if it's something as simple as erasing a misconception, clearing up the fuzzy edges around the subject of Christian Science.
Yeah, and they really should, because like I said, as I kind of discovered this, and this was probably about 7 years ago, and I was like, wow, how come they didn't teach, Christianity like this in church, and get away from all the judgment and self-righteousness? Why didn't they say, this is what Jesus Christ really was doing, and I think a lot of people get turned off by that righteousness and that judgmental feeling that you need to follow and do this, when in fact Christian Science is actually teaching, no, this is what he was really trying to teach us. We're all miracle workers. We all have that capacity. We're all the embodiment of God. And I thought to myself, well, I bet a lot more people would be awakened and be excited or even thrilled, to pursue this and find their lives actually improve for the special gifts that they have to share with people here on Earth.
And that's actually the science sense of Christian Science. The actual root, the original root of the word science is true knowledge. It's only been since the late 1800s, early 1900s that the concept of science has been completely wrapped up in a materialistic five physical senses approach to looking at life, to looking at reality. So that's a more modern definition. But the actual root of science is true knowledge. And what Jesus was giving us, what Jesus was teaching us, was not just theory. For Jesus, his theology healed the sick. His theology produced results, and consistent results. And that's where Christian Science comes in. We're looking at, it's an examination of Jesus' life and his teachings and how to bring out those same results that he, his followers, the early Christians for about the first 300 years until it was lost as a general practice, how the kind of healing that they were able to produce. Thankfully, this whole, practice that Jesus did introduce and did establish was rediscovered by Mary Baker Eddy in 1866, later published in her book in 1875, Science and Health is Key to the Scriptures. She links the concept of Christianity with science. It's Christianity that works, that actually changes lives.
Yeah, like I said, I know the listeners out there, maybe some of them are scratching their head, I'm hearing this preaching thing again, but if they were really listening, that's not what we're doing at all. We're trying to open yourself to a possibility. Just explore it. I think you'll be very fascinated, and you might also find yourself liberated to realize what scares you now is that you're more powerful than you could have ever imagined.
Absolutely.
But it still takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of muscle strength, just like when, you're trying a new sport, whatever the case is, to put this into action. Now, people can find out the time and the dates and where you're speaking. What is the website they can go to discover more about that?
Sure. the website, I'll be speaking on May 15th in Portland, and the website where you can get the details is pdxcslectureseries.com. I'll say that again, pdxcslectureseries.com.
Very good. And how about your blog? Where can people find out more about that?
Well, there you can go to michellenanoushcsb.com. It's my website, and you can just poke around, and you'll find a blog in there.
Very good. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Have a great day.
You too. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.